And then we'll turn to a bit of a panel discussion where we really engage these ideas on development, on phase out, on agroecology, on 100% renewable possibilities, and on African financing mechanisms. What are the alternatives to us just waiting for money to be delivered? Because if anyone's been paying attention, we're not necessarily getting as much as we'd like. And then we'll open the floor to questions, and we'll have a chance to engage with you and all of the questions that you've brought today. So thanks again for being here. I'm now going to hand to Fadhel to give us a bit of insight into the discussion that we're going to have today. Thanks, Fadhel.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to start this presentation and this discussion with all of you here. This report, we're referring to as the Red Report, is a report that was produced by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, and it's a group that was convened by Dr. Youba Sokona, who's the outgoing vice chair of the IPCC. And what we try to do in this report is really revive an old tradition that's been, let's say, set aside for a variety of reasons that we can discuss. An old tradition about a different approach to development. An old tradition that started as soon as many of our countries in Africa started to move away from the colonial era into independence. And there was a lot of thought that was put into this approach to development. So reviving that tradition, but also breaking the silos intellectually and policy-wise between the discussions that we frequently have about development are siloed away from the discussions we have about climate policy, siloed away from the discussions that we have about energy policy. And we as intellectuals and finally these COP discussions are finally bringing these things together. I mean, if you go back 10 years ago when you talk about climate, there's no discussion about debt. But today those conversations are slowly getting interlinked. So this is what essentially in a fundamental level what we did with this report. And I'm going to start the first part of the presentation kind of setting the stage of the historical context in which we operate in the African continent. So Africa, just like the rest of the global south, we face a very complex set of intertwined challenges. And it's not really sufficient to say we're going to prioritize this and ignore all the other issues. So it's an approach that the approach required has to be multi-pronged and multifaceted in order for us to address the structural root causes that create, all the challenges that we have today. And that's why we intentionally link development to climate, to energy, to all the other challenges that we face. And when it comes to the historical context, Africa's structural crises are rooted in the historical context of colonialism. Africa was not colonized because it was poor. It was colonized precisely because it was extremely rich, and it is still an extremely rich continent. And when you think of the colonial role that was imposed on the continent, and unfortunately the post-colonial role that was also imposed on the continent, and that's why we need to make sure that moving forward we escape from that role. The role that we've played in this global system can be summarized in three major points. Number one, we've been assigned the role as the continent for cheap raw materials to be exported to the global north, to the industrialized world. Number two, we're the place where finished products from the industrialized world are dumped into our large consumer market. So we're the consumers of those finished products. And number three, and most importantly, we're the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global north is outsourced to us under the label of development and job creation and technical cooperation. And what it does is that it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. In other words, the type of manufacturing and industrialization, quote unquote industrialization that we pursue is the type where you have to import the machines, you have to import the intermediate components to assemble, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, and we even have to import the packaging. So what we produce and what we export is low value added content, and we use low cost labor racing to the bottom, right? We produce low value added content for export, and what we import is high value added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports, you're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. It's a structural trap, and it's the most important one to escape. So as we move forward, we can't continue to play this role, these three major roles. So even as we talk about green industrialization today, and I'm glad we see many of our leaders talking about the imperative of transforming our economy and focusing on green industrialization, there's a whole spectrum of green industrialization. There's the kind that still keeps you locked at the bottom of the global value chain, where you produce renewable energy to manufacture low value added content to be exported and consumed in the global north. That still locks us at the bottom of the value chain. But there's also the green industrialization, which is what we want, that allows us to use renewable energy and to manufacture and deploy high value added products that will be used in Africa, starting primarily by manufacturing and deploying the clean energy infrastructure, using the strategic minerals that we have, using the market at scale that we have to produce and deploy the technology on the African continent to deliver electricity to the 600 million people who have no access to electricity today, to manufacture and deploy the clean cooking technology to deliver to the 970 million people on the continent who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis. Again, not manufacture for export, but manufacture to build the basic building blocks of development and prosperity: energy, clean cooking, clean transportation, and beyond. So that's the spectrum of green industrialization we want for the African continent. So as we negotiate this transition, we want to be vigilant and careful not to get locked into the bottom of the global value chain once again, but with green energy. So that is critical, I think, for our discussion. And when it comes to the external debt problem that all of us are working on and aware of and trying to address, external debt is a symptom of deeper structural issues. And we summarize them here. Number one, lack of food sovereignty. According to UNCTAD, Africa imports 85% of its food, not by accident, by design. Why? Because of the rules of international trade have put us into that place. As soon as we became independent, the global north started to worry about its own food sovereignty, because we used to be the breadbasket of the global north. So what happened? You have the European Union putting forward the CAP policy, Common Agricultural Policy, which is a fundamental pillar of the European Union to this day. It wasn't just the European Union, the former Soviet Union, also Russia and the Ukraine became big players in the grain sector, and so did many of the key players today, the US, Canada, Japan, Australia, and so on. And that forced our farmers into giving up the production of core crops, wheat, barley, and corn, and had to switch to cash crops for exports. So that means as soon as you specialize in cash crops, you have to think about the taste of your consumers and what they want. So you have to start using non-native crops, which means you have to pump them with water that you don't always have. You have to pump them with fertilizers that you import, pesticides that you import, and that gets us locked into a food dependency system. So that's the first structural deficiency. The second one is the lack of energy sovereignty. And here I include even our biggest exporter on the continent, Nigeria. Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline. So it's the same trap. You export the raw material, you re-import the higher value version of it, the gasoline, kerosene, and petrochemicals. And if fossil fuels was going to be the source of development and prosperity, Nigeria would be an economic powerhouse today, delivering aid and technical assistance to neighbors across the continent. But of course, that is one of the key traps that we're talking about, let alone the countries that are not like Nigeria, that are not exporters of fossil fuels, but rather importers. So that's the second structural weakness. And no country in the world can function without food, without energy. And we have those two deficiencies to begin with. And number three, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we're locked at the bottom of the global value chain with low value added manufacturing or purely extractive industries. So take these three structural deficits, food deficits, energy deficits, and manufacturing deficits. You have structural trade deficits. And the picture that you see there is the data for the entire African continent. You can sort of eyeball the composition of our exports relative to our imports. And the picture is similar country by country across the entire continent and across the global south, actually. So what happens when you have a structural trade deficit, as you all know, is that the value of your currency falls relative to the dollar. And when you have a weaker currency, anything you need to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine for your people, it costs you more. So you're literally importing inflation. And that immediately puts us in a defensive position. So our governments do two things to defend our economy from this imported inflation. We start subsidizing food and fuel to protect the most vulnerable. And that's a Band-Aid solution, and it's unsustainable in the long term. And number two, we ask our central bankers to please try to stabilize the exchange rate. How do you stabilize the exchange rate in an emergency situation? You have to borrow dollars and euros, and that feeds the debt cycle. The good news is that the structural solutions are right there on display looking at us. The solutions are investments in food sovereignty and agroecology. Even if not country by country, but as regional blocks, we need to have resilience on the food front. And the good news is that this is a development solution, a debt solution, but it's also a climate solution. Number two, investing in renewable energy sovereignty, our biggest potential, as my colleague Nicholas will show in a few minutes. And that's, again, a development solution and a climate solution. And finally, escaping the bottom of the global value chain is the most transformative approach to development by prioritizing manufacturing our needs, which is clean cooking, clean energy, clean transportation. Again, it's a development solution, it's a debt solution, and it's a climate solution. So it's a win-win for everybody on the continent. It's a win-win for the planet. It's very important to avoid these structural traps and avoid the policies that we repeatedly use that get us actually deeper into these problems. So when we look at it from a debt perspective, we're told, well, you need foreign currency. So you need to rewire your economy to do all the things you need in order to earn more dollars and more euros to get out of the debt. So tourism sounds like a great approach. You bring millions of tourists, they bring foreign currency, they create millions of jobs. What's not to like? Except when you don't have food sovereignty, when you don't have energy sovereignty, and you bring millions of tourists, you have to feed them food that you must import. You have to transport them, heat and cool the hotels, energy imported again. And you have to set up all the fancy infrastructure to, so that people can have fun and enjoy the country. So you import even high-tech infrastructure that you don't manufacture on the continent. So you actually end up accelerating the sources, the structural problems that you have. But if you have food sovereignty, if you have energy sovereignty, then tourism can be a win. And of course, we want it to be green and ecological and cultural and all that. But the net impact of tourism, of the way we've been doing it, racing to the bottom, without taking care of the food sector and the energy sector as basic pillars, it ends up being actually a net negative. Foreign direct investment in FDI and export-oriented growth, which has been pushed on the continent, on the global south for decades. If you're locked at the bottom of the global value chain, you can double, triple, quadruple your export, you're still losing structurally. And that's why export-led growth hasn't worked for the continent. That's why foreign direct investment is actually worse, because it's extractive in the sense that the profits generated by foreign direct investment are repatriated. So it's even more extractive than export-led growth. Remittances, we're exporting, young people and working age, groups for the sake of remittances. That's the biggest source of brain drain, of course. That's not how we're going to build the continent. Financial liberalization. We're told if you set up a mini Wall Street and attract foreign investors things will be great. Well, except, you know, the kind of investors that will come to your little stock market on the African continent are not interested in development. They're interested in buying low and selling high. And they want your central bank to set up the economy for them to win. And as soon as they see risks, they leave. And then they leave, you know, damage behind. We've seen this happen in South Africa and Mexico, in Turkey, in Brazil, and many countries try to set up financial markets to attract investors. They end up with speculators. And then finally, this idea of privatizing state-owned enterprises. And privatization, again, it's a spectrum of types of privatization. But the majority of the type of privatization that we've been trapped into since the 1990s was the extractive kind, where you privatize your telecom, your airport, your airline, your infrastructure, and then you lose strategic sectors, sectors of sovereignty actually, sectors of public services, and the few $100 million you get, depending on how much you're selling, you end up using them to service the debt. And then you can't privatize them again after 5 years or 10 years. You've lost that sector once and for all. So we have to be very careful about this. And I was asked one time, you know, recently, what do you make of the fact that we have this external debt problem that keeps getting worse after decades and decades of development strategies? And to me, if you're looking at the dominant model of economic development that's been imposed on us via structural adjustment programs, via conditionalities, by the major international financial institutions. The fact that we're in a debt trap today means one of two things. It's either pure incompetence, which means we need to reject that development model, or it's intentional entrapment. Either way, it means we need to develop our own coherent, transformational, comprehensive development strategy and escape the traditional traps. And when you put this on a global scale, if you net out global financial transactions between global north and global south, including trade, interest payment, remittances, debt payments, debt relief, everything included, the net amount is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. Let me say it again, $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. Money moving in the wrong direction. So if we summarize climate finance and where we are, you have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. You have $100 billion promised more than a decade ago and not delivered. Maybe it was delivered. We're still not sure if it was delivered last year. You have the Green Climate Fund that, despite several efforts to increase pledges, we're still talking about small billions. And then that white space on the left, we should update it. We should put the $665 million of loss and damage fund that was pledged a few days ago. And million, not billion. So there's something fundamentally wrong about the economic architecture that produces these effects. An economic architecture that includes its subsets are the financial architecture, the international trade architecture, the international investment architecture, investment rules, and the international taxation architecture. And when you look at how these architectures were designed and when they were designed not by us, not for us. So it's not surprising that they don't produce the results that actually work for us. So when we talk about redesigning the global financial architecture, as we talk about climate finance, as we talk about debt, this is what we mean. We need a system redesign, not slight reforms here and there, not just concessional loans, not just hitting the pause button when we have a major climate event. Those things are helpful, don't get me wrong, but that's not the kind of transformation that we really need to deliver the impact that we're talking about.
Prof,
So,
just a quick timer. I'd hate to ever cut
Yes.
your amazing speeches, but if we can,
yes,
we're at
absolutely.
16 minutes.
And I'll just close with an inspiring line that really motivates a lot of this work. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in the context of the civil rights movement, once said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism." And similarly today, we need to think of the challenge that we're facing in this way. No more tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism. We need structural transformation of the kind that I described here over the last few minutes. And I'll give the floor to my colleague, Nicholas. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadhel. Hope you can hear me. I will provide a few snapshots of a deep dive in this report that we are really talking about. There are a few copies, and it's possible to download on justtransitionafrica.org. This report does look at energy in a bit more detail, but also outlines a whole spectrum of issues as Fadhel outlined, and he will come back as well on the finance side in a few minutes. So I won't give you any really detailed overview, but I will give you a sense of what we're talking about in this energy spotlight. And I'll start with this picture, which also contextualizes a bit of why I'm talking here as obviously non-African. I've been working, as Colin said, with African colleagues for a long time, been part of several very ambitious initiatives, the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative back at Paris, more recently the LDC initiative, and also working very closely with civil society colleagues and academics in the field. But I'm coming out of a context of development and alternative development. I was at an organization called the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, which issued a report called What Now or Another Development almost 50 years ago. And that still stands firm. And Fadhel has been very much influenced by this work as well, so we've connected recently on this. And the key point here is to say this is, we need to talk about energy, we need to talk about climate, we need to talk about agriculture, many sectors, economics, but we also need to kind of see that the root here, and you just talked about that, Fadhel, goes down to the sort of worldviews that underpins all of this, and the idea and model of development, which carries so much across continents. So this graph really shows, in the context of energy, what this means. We have a whole spectrum here of countries, and, it's evident that we all need to change. Countries on the far right on this screen obviously need to drastically reduce their energy consumption. They have to go to renewables, that's a no-brainer, but they also have to reduce their overconsumption. I think looking around Dubai gives oneself a bit of a reality check here, right? There's no developed country anywhere. We're all developing countries, but we need to develop in a different way, in a very different kind of trajectories. The countries on the far left, of which many are African, need to increase their energy use tremendously, many, many times, for many, many of their folks, although the elites still need to cut back, right? And then we have the sort of other spectrum of countries that needs to do something in between. The point here is that we're looking to a fundamental rethink about what well-being and progress really means. And energy is such a guide here in terms of what we do in the energy sector to get to that. The transition that we outline in this report when it comes to energy is one of a different energy system at the core. It's not just about replacing fuels. It's not just about getting some, renewable wind and solar farms and just imagine that the system will look the same. It will have the same big corporations driving it. It will have the same large-scale, grid centralized way of delivering energy to everyone. It's more like the mobile phone revolution in Africa that you've all experienced already, right? It's a different way. And the luck here is that what happens to be the energy systems, the energy sources, the energy technologies that are good for climate, potentially good for climate at least, wind, solar, hydro, happen to be also having the potential for being distributed, being diversified in ownership, being something that you can control locally, something that you can even manufacture, maybe not locally, but in your country or in your region. And that's pure luck. It could have been differently. We can't have people-centered nuclear or people-centered coal, but we can have people-centered solar and wind. And that means that we can build a new system that isn't saying just small scale, just distributed, but it would be largely so. You can start tomorrow and you can electrify the whole of Africa over, theoretically, a few months. You could have solar panels on every rooftop in the whole continent, and it wouldn't take long, and it's actually the cheapest you can do. And they mix it up with, of course, other things at larger scale. And all of a sudden, we have the potential for not just a different energy system, but a different economy, a different kind of democracy, really. So the report is outlining a number of principles that would be very key to take on board at the outset for African decision makers and civil society, of course, and anyone else, in how to design and plan for this. And I think that really is a key thing. This won't happen without intention. This won't happen without plans. The potential is there, but if we don't have, and this doesn't go for Africa only, it goes as much for my country, Sweden, and anywhere else, if we don't decide what are the principles for this new energy system, we will end up with a copy of the fossil fuel, corporate-driven, fossil fuel industry-like system with a green surface. You will be carrying the same kind of problems that we're seeing today, environmentally, socially, and many other ways. But the potential is there. If we plan for it, we can have a very, very different system in place. So that means long-term development planning. It means whole sets of policies that already exist. It certainly includes highlighting the issue of cooking and clean cooking and electrification of cooking, particularly for Africa. And of course, seeing energy not just as a commodity that the private sector and the market and the companies will take care of, but as a common good. And that will not happen without genuine participation, stakeholder participation, equity, and again, back to that first graph, a notion of sufficiency. It's not just more of everything at any scale. It's about catering to real needs for those who really are in need. And again, as I just outlined, it's very clear, and I think we're seeing this over the last year, the whole race for critical minerals not least. This transition to renewables, we outlined in this report very, very strongly, is that those pitfalls aren't just about the sort of scale and nature of the system as we plan it, but also in the way, how it is deployed on lands, what kinds of mineral policy will we have to ensure that we don't open up for new abuses and land grabs, and how do we ensure that the sites, the land, the kinds of project development that is needed isn't just done, with abuses of people living on these lands. So we're outlining a whole lot of this and pointing to the need, and I think Fadhel will get back to that in terms of the industrial policy and the need for critical minerals kind of approach as well. Of course, we do need to fight the fossil fuel industry at the same time and the fossil fuel dependency and mindsets. That's outlined as well in this report, and I think we've seen a lot of that happening here and now in this COP, not the least. And Africa, again, is a battleground. And as Fadhel just outlined, the kind of stranded assets that African countries, not the least, are on their way to get stuck with unless there is a U-turn and a reconsideration along the lines of this report, and along the lines of, as Fadhel gets back to, the economic arguments for not going that way, the economic arguments for investing in your renewable energy-driven and centered economic model to break dependencies. It's there. So I just came also from some very, very exciting parallel, almost side events here happening right before on the equity review that some of you are aware of, which outlines the kind of end dates that are needed also for developing countries, with support, of course, but still there's no place in this basically constrained, almost finished carbon budget for any expansion. But how do we do this in a way that is working for also developing countries, African countries? It's clear that there is a huge potential, and it needs, again, cooperation. Sebel, of course, will talk about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is making huge strides here at this very COP as well. I'm just going to end here with the kind of concluding image here around the energy potential. Africa is, as Fadhel said, is rich, right? It's endowed. look at that circle. There's no country that is better equipped to really make this happen for its own needs, particularly for its own needs. And I see Sven Teske here in the audience as well, who gave a brilliant presentation yesterday around 3 country studies that PowerShift Africa has been supporting in outlining how genuinely 100% renewable energy system can be designed for African countries, drawing on the immense resources that we have. So it's a really, really promising situation. And to wrap up, just to highlight also how, again, these initiatives that are already existing and are country-driven, country-led, like the LDC initiative, where Sven did his presentation and some of us are also involved, is completely aligned with the sort of framework and the principles in this report. And it really stresses the point that I think Fadhel will get back to now in terms of how this is possible, but it's only possible through genuine collaboration and cooperation, South-South collaboration, cooperation, African, Pan-African approaches. There's, you know, no end to potential and possibility if you get together. So I'll hand over back to Fadhel.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'll just close by focusing and zooming in on financing the transition. And here, there are things that we can do domestically, and there are things that need to be done multilaterally at the international level, especially when it comes to the financial architecture and financing the just transition in the Global South and in Africa in particular. So clearly the focus has to be on those strategic sectors that I described earlier, so that we tackle both the structural transformation needed on the development front to get out of the debt trap, and coincidentally, those are the same issues and sectors that need to be addressed on the climate front: the food sovereignty and agroecology, renewable energy deployment for the continent, and manufacturing of renewable energy infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, transportation infrastructure as basic pillars of development. I'll give you an example using my own country here, Tunisia. 2 hypothetical scenarios. The one on the left is a mainstream approach that tells us it cannot be done. Don't even try. And the alternative development approach that kicks in the just transition process. So let's say Tunisia wants to spend 2 billion dinars, not dollars, dinars in domestic currency, on health and education. Let's say these are the sectors we want to prioritize. The model of the mainstream approach tells us you're going to end up with more imports of food, energy, medical equipment. It's going to increase your trade deficit. Therefore, your currency will get weaker. You have a weaker currency because of the trade deficit. And you're going to have an inflation pass-through effect. Anything you import now is going to cost you more because of a weaker currency. It may even cause hyperinflation. So you end up with more external debt because now you have to finance that deficit. And international lenders will tell you, you need to cut spending. So austerity. So you end up with less investment in health and education. We're back to square one. And you end up with more unemployment, brain drain, social, economic, and political tensions. The classic scenario. So conclusion, don't even try. It doesn't work. Let the market deal with health and education, because that's what the market does, right? The alternative development approach. I'm using the same numerical example. Tunisia is going to spend 2 billion dinars on strategic sectors, but targeted differently. We're going to spend 1 billion dinars on health and education, and then we're going to spend the next billion dinars on addressing the structural issues. That is, increasing domestic productive capacity in food, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and cracking down on corruption, abusive price setters, importers of luxury goods via taxation and regulation. This is the policy space of a sovereign state. And if we do that, this is the logic that's going to kick in. You're going to have fewer imports of food and energy. Every green kilowatt hour you produce locally saves you its equivalent in dollars you had to borrow, its equivalent in interest you had to pay over that debt for decades. Every metric ton of wheat or corn you produce at home saves you the equivalent in dollars you had to import, you had to borrow, and interest you had to pay. So you have fewer imports of food and energy, you have a lower trade deficit, you have a stable, if not stronger, exchange rate now, and you're going to have no inflation pass-through effect because your currency is still stable or even stronger. You have lower external debt over time, higher credit rating from credit rating agencies, and you increase the foreign currency reserves that you have at the central bank, and now you're more resilient to external shocks, to the food system, the energy system, like the conflict in the Ukraine or OPEC price increases. You have a lower carbon footprint because you're producing the right things at home, and you have more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life for all. This is within reach. This is possible. We're not talking about impossible dreams. I hope that moving forward, the conditionalities imposed by the World Bank and the IMF are these types of conditionalities. We'll step in and help you over the next 24 months, but this is what you need to do. Invest in food sovereignty and agroecology and renewable energy to get yourself out of the debt trap. Instead, they impose conditionalities that do exactly the opposite. So this is possible with domestic resources. At the international level, of course, there's a lot that needs to be done. And I talked about the importance of the global financial architecture, reforming and regulating and so on. And let's talk about debt cancellation. This has to be part of the framework for a just transition. And the best development model that we know works like a charm is a model that was used after World War II, the model of reconstruction and development of Germany. It was two things that happened. 1953, almost 70 years ago, 50% of Germany's debt was canceled. 50%. And countries in the global south, African countries, actually contributed to that debt cancellation. So let's talk about reciprocity there. Number two, not just debt cancellation by itself will not work. We can cancel the entire African debt today. I guarantee you in 10 years we have a debt crisis because the structural issues need to be addressed. Number two, what was done to develop and rebuild Germany was an industrial policy. And that was the Marshall Plan, strategic investments to turn Germany into an industrial powerhouse. And that was funded not by loans and debt traps, but by grants primarily. The Marshall Plan, the US contributed as a gift the equivalent of 5% of its GDP. After a very expensive war, which came after a very expensive Great Depression, somehow the US managed to afford 5% of its GDP as a generous gift to rebuild Germany. And look at the outcome. Germany today is an economic powerhouse delivering aid and technical assistance to other countries around the world, and is independent economically and technologically and so on. So 5% of US GDP in today's dollars would be roughly $1.2 trillion. That's one country alone. We'd be dancing on the tables today if we have $1.2 trillion announced at this COP for the Loss and Damage Fund, right? Instead, you know the numbers that we got. And reparations, climate reparations. I'm not gonna talk about colonial reparations today. Climate reparations, it's a scientific concept, to me at least. We have a carbon budget. Some countries have exceeded their carbon budget and therefore are in deficit and owe a debt, a climate debt. And when I owe you a debt, let's say I owe you $100, I'm supposed to pay you at the end of the month. But instead, I'm coming to you and saying, I'll lend you $10, concessional. But I get to tell you what to do with the $10. And then I'll give you maybe another $5, but you have to give me your forest. And then, come up with all kinds of schemes, but I'm actually not paying my debt. I'm just getting you into more debt traps, and I'm taking more of your sovereignty. And I get to control exactly what you do. We have to shift the conversation. A debt is a debt. Sorry, I get too excited about these things. But I'm not a diplomat, I'm an academic.
We're gonna wrap.
So to conclude, the structural issues, but I want to highlight one point and then I'll stop, which is the importance of redesigning the global financial, investment, trade, and taxation architecture. And we've seen what the African continent can do when we're united. About 3 weeks ago, or maybe 4 weeks ago, at the UN, when we pushed through the UN Tax Convention. It was Africa's work, and it's transformational. It will be transformational. That's one subcomponent of what needs to be done, and that's a fight of its own. But to be honest, one of the blind spots that we still have in the COPs, now we're doing well on the debt and the finance and development front. This is part of the discourse. But the blind spot is trade and investment rules, because that's part of the architecture. That needs to be part of the core COP discussions moving forward, because you can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally decolonized yet. And the financial architecture, the trade architecture, again, designed not by us, not for us, can't deliver the justice that we're talking about. And on the responsibility that we have in the Global South, in Africa in particular, we need to develop our own coherent, long-term strategic vision. Because if you don't have a long-term vision for yourself, I guarantee you, you're already part of somebody else's vision. And everybody has a right to have a vision for themselves. Everybody has a right to use their economic diplomacy and incentives to nudge everybody else where they want to see them. And it's incumbent upon us as Africans, as people of the Global South, and our leaders to sit down and think long-term. What is this vision? How do we reposition Africa on a global scale, not to dominate the world, but to reposition so we can rebalance our position economically, and that's really a core component of a just transition framework. And with that, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Prof. So I have a quick question for our three panelists who haven't yet presented, and then we're going to open it to you guys for your questions, because I know there's a lot to engage on. And we're hoping the discussion is going to continue long beyond today, because the 45 minutes we have remaining will not be enough to plumb the depths of how we're going to get a better world. But I wanted to turn first to Seble on my right. So for those who came in late, Seble is the head of campaigns and advocacy for Africa for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. So Seble, you worked with one of the campaigns that's actually trying to look at the practical instruments and tools we can use to unite people behind a transition. And you guys focus a lot on this idea of a global just transition, that it's not just one country or the other, but there's some way that we need to think about these mechanisms in a more united way. And I'm interested in your reaction to this vision and what's been outlined by Fadhel and Nicholas, and how this synergizes with the treaty.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you've all highlighted it so comprehensively, but I think it's important to reiterate how much the fossil fuel system in Africa is controlled by foreign ownership. It's 60% of fossil fuel companies operating in Africa are by companies headquartered outside of the continent. So you'll see Shell, you'll see Total, you'll see Eni extracting a lot of the coal, oil, and gas on the continent. And the majority of this extraction is for export. Current data shows that over 90% of gas extraction on the continent is for export. And you've highlighted also, Nicholas, the example from Russia's war on Ukraine and how much the energy crisis in Europe drove a scramble for African gas. And this is locking the continent into decades of fossil fuel infrastructure. 70% of the oil and gas projected to be developed on the continent could be at risk of becoming a stranded asset. So we have to be lucid in the fact that the extraction of fossil fuels has not provided energy access for the continent. It's fulfilling other continents' short-term energy needs and locking us into infrastructure that has caused human rights violations, failed to deliver our energy needs, and is causing health impacts and gender-based violence along the extraction cycle. And we know that it's not working because the continent is home to 75% of the world's population that's living without access to electricity. There's 600 million people on the continent that do not have electricity. So we cannot keep repeating the same cycle and expecting different results. We talked also about finance. And the money that goes into the fossil fuel industry is ridiculous and obscene in how high it is. In the panel we were in before on the civil society equity review on a fair phase out of fossil fuels, our director mentioned that $7 trillion every year go into subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. That's 13 million every single minute. And so the financing that we're looking for an energy transition can come in minutes or in days to be able to finance this transition. So what we propose from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is that none of this can happen in isolation, that international cooperation is essential. There's countries like Nigeria and Angola that have vast amounts of their government revenue coming from oil extraction. The transition or the inevitable transition to a different economy will not happen domestically only. There needs to be finance and there needs to be open technology transfers. There needs to be debt cancellations, like Fadhel mentioned, with systemic change for that economic diversification and alternative development pathways to be possible. So there's 3 pillars that ground the fossil fuel treaty proposal. One is around ending expansion of fossil fuels, so constraining the supply and production of fossil fuels in the richest countries first, and providing finance and tech transfers to dependent nations to be able to actually make that transition. And we've seen in the COP how much the momentum behind the treaty has grown. We started with 8 countries backing the treaty at the beginning of COP, and now we're at 12. And I think most significant to note was that Colombia announced their support for the treaty last week. Colombia is a country with significant oil and coal extraction. So, and there's also Timor-Leste that's among those countries with around 60% of its revenue coming from oil extraction. So there's big fossil fuel producers that are joining this initiative because they understand that the financial support and the international cooperation is essential to any transition away from fossil fuels that will be essential for the African continent. Nicholas also mentioned the renewable energy potential that we have. So it's around 40% of the global renewable energy potential is located in Africa. We have yet to tap into this potential. It's 60% of the world's best solar resources, yet we only have 1% of the world's installed solar capacity. And why is this? There's a lack of financing, there's a lack of capacity. So how do we actually create the financial space for this to be possible, the training programs for fossil fuel workers to be trained in the renewable energy economy, where estimates show that 5 to 25 times more jobs get created with investment in renewable energy than in fossil fuels. So we have a future to build that is much more prosperous and abundant, and we happen to be in the continent with the most potential. So we have to truly reflect if we're going to keep entrenching ourselves in a fossil economy that serves the world. As Fadhel mentioned, we give away our raw materials, we import the refined goods. Nigeria is home to 85 million people without access to electricity, even though it's the biggest fossil fuel producer on the country. So are we going to continue to replicate that model, or are we going to see that we actually are endowed with the highest potential on Earth, and we can actually capitalize on this? We're still a rural continent. Renewable energy allows for the distributed access also to electricity, not these huge centralized grids that take a lot of investment and time to build. And that we can have, as they were mentioning, regional industrialization and trade among the continent to actually be a leader in this transition instead of entrenching ourselves in a model that doesn't give our continent energy access. It provides it for the short-term needs of other continents. So I think that's
Amazing.
fine to leave with, yeah.
Thank you so much. Fatuma, I'm going to turn to you next. For those who came in a bit late, Fatuma leads the African group negotiations on just transition. And obviously, this has been a COP where that's been a contentious issue, and I know you've had to pull some all-nighters and fight the fight. But you know, people have many different conceptions of what just transition means. For some, it's as narrow and limited as compensation for jobs in a certain area. What this report has outlined is a much more expansive vision of just transition as something that really allows us to reconceptualize what good development looks like. I'm interested in your perspective on how the African group has played a role in leading this broadening of a definition, and how we can find space within the negotiations to talk about a much different kind of development, not just a very narrow form of transition.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colin. And I'm afraid my presentation would not be as eloquent as the practical things happening out there in the world, but just to give you a quick indication of what we are doing in the negotiation. As you said, in Sham, we adopted and established a work program on just transition pathways, and it's the role of this COP now to really design that work program, go on to the objective of that work program. What do we need to do? How do we do it? What would be the outcome and all that? So since Bonn, we've been negotiating with our partners, and as you indicated, there are differences in the scope. There are differences in how we understand just transition, but the role of the work program is not necessarily to define just transition, but rather the way we look at it is a space where we guide and more effectively support the implementation of just transitions to low emissions and climate resilient development in a way that contribute to boosting economic development, creating jobs, and importantly reducing and addressing the issues of inequalities and the whole concept of equity and justice in our process, which I'm sure everyone agrees that that is the main concept that defines the different decisions that are going to be taken actually in this COP. So what are the key priorities for Africa? I think important issue, as much as the Paris Agreement talks about the goals, the 3 goals, the key issue that has not been discussed in our process is defining what are the different pathways, because it's not equal for everyone. So understanding the different pathways and really unpacking what are the implications of these pathways for our economic development, for trade, for example, on finance, all the aspects that Professor Fadhel talked about. What are the implications for socioeconomic development in our countries? And that includes discussing issues of energy and the just energy transition, particularly for the African side, emphasizing on the point around access to modern energy, which is a big issue for Africa. Looking at adaptation and resilience, what are the key justice elements that need to be discussed there? Because when we talk about the pathway to 1.5, that has an implication on the risks that need to be mitigated. What does adaptation and lack of adaptation mean for African countries? Those are some of the things that we need to discuss, as well as from the finance perspective, the issues of debt, the proposals for global taxes, for example, the just energy transition partnerships, who is guiding them? There are good ideas and good ways, innovative ways of building bridges and doing the just transition, but do we have space where we can discuss and guide those processes? So that's how we looked at it from the African perspective, because the time is quite short. The discussion here has been around the scope, as I said, the objective, the institutional arrangement, what are the outputs, and how does it fit to other processes. I would say, based on very detailed negotiations for the last few days, we've agreed on a compromise text, as I would say. We couldn't agree on the objective. Of course, everyone just agrees on reiterating what we have from Sham. I mean, in this process, it's quite difficult. But then in the scope, at least we were able to broaden it up. We have the elements which are covered in the Sham decision, for example, looking at pathways, looking at dimensions of energy, socioeconomic development, as well as workforce and creating decent job, particularly for those affected by the transition. That's important, but at least we were able to include aspects around opportunities and challenges for sustainable development in our countries. Issues of international cooperation, means of implementation was quite problematic in that discussion, so we couldn't land that. But we have also adaptation, space for discussing adaptation and just aspects of adaptation. We could not agree on the timeline and the way the G77, for example, needed it, and Africa. Having a discussion, because we are implementing the Paris Agreement, we can't have a stop for discussion around just transition, but we could only agree on having this discussion until 2026 with the view of agreeing on how we continue at that particular point, at that COP moving forward. We secured the space where we discuss in this process as much as make decisions annually at the COP, because our partners really wanted a space where we just discuss, share experience, and full stop. It's just a dialogue. We're not taking decisions around justice. So that at least is in the decision, the draft decision at the moment, but there are pending issues around human rights. Some countries really pushing for inclusion of human rights and discussion around that in the scope of just transition. Others calling for special situations in their countries. Others want to elaborate on issues of trade and unilateral measures which are taken, and that's turned out to be highly contentious. So those issues are packed and in brackets at the moment. We left for the presidency to take that forward. So that's where we are. We have a draft, most of the things cleaned, But there are some specific brackets which the co-president is trying to resolve. But moving forward, I think we would have, if we take forward the decision as it is right now, we would have space where we can unpack some of those ideas and aspects. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fatuma. Mohamed, I'm going to come to you, and you have the difficult job of being the last one to speak before the questions that everyone wants to ask. So you also have the challenge of brevity. But you've been doing a lot of amazing work over the last few years to translate things like this, you know, not only to help lead on defining these visions, but on actually trying to make them a reality. Now, we can talk about nice ideas, but if we don't really build country support, movement support, and get the buy-in, we know that they might never go anywhere. Can you tell us a bit more about what we can do collectively and what this room might be able to do collectively to actually take these ideas forward, to make them something that's more practical and real?
Thanks so much, Colin, and thank you, my fellow panelists, and to all of you for showing up to what I hope is the best side event at COP28. I don't say that lightly, especially given that the continent of Africa is the least responsible for climate change. We all know we're suffering faster and worse the impact of climate change. But that continent that is poor and has over 600 million people without electricity, 1 billion people without access to clean cooking, wants to lead the world. It means something for the most affected geography and the least responsible to want to chart a different path, not just for Africa, but to inspire the world. I've been very privileged in my life in working with such amazing folks and doing things at multiple levels. And I want to just explain what drove us to do things radically different. When I say radically different, I mean, getting to the root cause of the problem. We come to these COPs, and this is the 28th COP. But you know what? We come with a defensive strategy as a continent. Never have we come to help set such a compelling vision. If you've heard Fadhel and Nicholas present on behalf of the others, you'll agree that this is a groundbreaking vision for the continent of Africa. And I don't say this as, one of the folks who helped to make it happen, but I say it as somebody who's read far too many reports in his life, including on energy. What we're putting out here is an opportunity for us to address the interconnected crises that Africa faces. And that is something you'll think is a no-brainer. But here we are talking about climate and not centering around energy and how Africa will leapfrog that energy and become a green leader. So the whole conversation around the energy package is divorced from the African reality. If you think about adaptation, we're still talking about defining a goal that many now think it's an African goal for adaptation rather than a global goal for adaptation. Because Africa are the biggest cheerleaders. They've tended to identify the world goal as an African goal, which is why they're using it as a bargaining chip rather than defining an ambitious target that helps all of us to reduce our vulnerability. Who today isn't vulnerable to climate change? It's true, Africa and the small island states were the first ones to actually suffer the impacts, but no part of the world is immune to climate impact. So the whole idea is so that we can collectively reduce vulnerability and build resilience. But they marginalize it such that you don't get the kind of hype you see around the energy, and not that we're delivering it on adaptation. They're actually going backwards on what they had even in the week text yesterday is what I've had overnight, that they're further weakening it. On finance, we're still talking about 100 billion, which has never been delivered. But the scale of resources that are needed to help deliver this vision in Africa alone is in the excess of 3 trillion. Now, you factor Asia, the most populous, continent on this planet, Latin America and the Caribbean, the scale will only grow. But none of our negotiators are brave enough to actually want to center an alternative vision that allows us to address these interconnected crises and do it in a way that allows us to live within the limited climate budget. The community that I've started my life with is the civil society. And I've slowly broadened out of that space. We still love our brand so much that we're siloed into our different spaces. If you're a climate organization, an energy organization, a food organization, a human rights organizations, you love that space rather than taking a sledgehammer and breaking the silos in a way that we can build a shared common space to help define an alternative vision. So what we've started doing with my brother Omar leading now is help build what we're calling the African Climate Movement Building Space, a movement of movement that brings together the diverse networks and movements in Africa. And the idea is to help build pressure on African leaders so that they can actually start to engage this alternative vision. And with the experts that we were lucky to convene and work with, we did so that we can actually help consolidate knowledge in the continent of Africa. Look at the NDCs, and I will just take this as an example. None of them were prepared by Africans. 54 countries. Consultants parachuted to Africa prepared the NDCs of the continent. And we have sufficient experts in the continent who understand the African context well. And we've never bothered to engage them in helping to articulate an alternative vision that addresses how Africa is going to contribute to the climate solution. When it comes to our political leaders, i.e. the policymakers, I said at the beginning, what they have is a guide, a playbook, but a playbook to play a defensive game. How they protect Africa from the burden that the rest wants to shift on the continent of Africa. And I must say that is not a winning strategy. That is a losing strategy. Where we are today, we need to rethink and reorient ourselves and ask ourselves, how will we actually deliver the continent we want and help that continent inspire the rest? I must say that second part, because many at times we forget that that cradle of mankind, if we get it right, we can set a different vision. Sven Teske is in the room. We're doing amazing 100% renewable energy modeling for 6 countries, and we've just completed the first draft. And if you're from Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, please engage my colleagues so that you can help us review those reports, and we will launch it in the next IRENA summit in Abu Dhabi. The reason I'm raising these things is so that as a community, we provided the thought leadership, but we also build the systems that will help us to realize it's not enough to call the scandal that happens in the space and point fingers. I want us to look at ourselves and challenge ourselves what we can do differently on the basis of this vision and deliver. Let me now end with 3 points. One is on the energy package. You've heard that there is a contestation around what decision we'll get, particularly on the side of the phase out of fossil fuels, right? I must say loudly and clearly, it's in Africa's interest to fight for a rapid, just, and equitable phase out of all fossil fuels. Why do I say that? We're on the front line. We're the world's canary. We're the ones burning fast. And so the quicker we address the root cause of the climate problem, the better for the continent of Africa. And then the second thing is on the tripling of renewable energy. Africa is doing 5 times the total installed capacity. So we're not even falling for the times 3 of what we have. 56 is what we have now. We want to take it over 300. And the ambition is to actually help industrialize Africa using renewables. And so that part is not in doubt. But you know what will make it impossible for Africa? Finance and technology transfer. If you don't center it around equity and make the conversation around how we help attract the right kind of investment, we will never phase out fossil fuels, we'll never deliver the ambition of 5 times renewables. The second part is on the strategic minerals that one of my colleagues touched on. The Global South controls nearly the world's global supply of strategic minerals. But the extractive industry that has majored in taking these raw materials will rather take them out of Africa to help support the decarbonization in the so-called advanced economies. What we want is how do we actually help the continent of Africa deliver the kind of industrialization where we can actually use those minerals to address the limited energy access challenge, including the challenge around clean cooking. If we don't break the structural trap that has us at the lowest level, we will be the source of new strategic minerals for others, and I would rather we use it to help meet Africa's needs, and then of course supply to the rest of the world, because it's in our interest to help in the global decarbonization. And so that shift in the mindset around finance and technology transfer, not to extract oil like Germany is wanting to do with the gas from Senegal, to help meet its energy crisis as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We invest in Africa to help address Africa's energy needs and then help the rest of the world. That shift won't happen through UNFCCC, just so that we're clear. If you're coming to UNFCCC to deliver that radical change, then you're mistaken. It will happen in our capital. It will happen in Addis Ababa, the seat of the African Union, so that together we can help reset the African minds, just like the African liberators in the 60s were able to help Africans liberate themselves so that we can deliver the climate ambition we need. I know I'll love to continue talking, but the dialogue will have to be sustained with all of you so that you become the foot soldiers that helps us realize this aspiration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohamed, and to the full panel. So I'll apologize to the crowd in that I failed you as a moderator because I've only left you with 20 minutes for questions. Now I'm going to ask for your help after failing you, which is to help me by only asking one question and trying to keep that question brief if you can. I'll respond by trying to hold these guys to brief answers. If we can get some hands, we'll start passing a mic around. So I see 1, 2, 3. We'll start with that as a first round, and then I'll come to more. So let's take 3 to start.
Where do you start?
1 over here. Thank you.
And who they want to direct the question to.
Yeah, and please also be clear who you're directing your question to. Thank you.
The mic is
Speak
not
up.
on.
We'll need you to speak
Closer
up.
to the mic.
It's not on. It's not working.
Can you just stand up and
I would like to thank our panelists for the brilliant presentation. My name is Ramdan. I work for the United Nations University. So my question is addressed to Fadhel. On the first part of your presentation, you brilliantly argued for the need to move away from concessional finance to the types of investment that will structurally improve African economies and move away from low-value economies to high-value economies. And on the second part, you also mentioned the case of Germany and argued for debt cancellation and massive investments. But if you ask international institutions why this is not happening, they will tell you it's probably because most African countries are deemed risky. So my question, and on that aspect of the risk in African countries, I think these are real issues, and you also...
The question, please, my friend.
No, I'm giving this background because my question is how exactly can we reconcile this need for massive investment and also dealing with a risky environment where we have high corruption, lack of accountability.
Perfect.
So there is a need to reconcile.
Thank you.
this, yeah.
Thank you. We'll take a few questions first. Can we bring it over here? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm from IRENA, and I really want to thank you for intellectual leadership. This is probably one of the best reports this year, and Mohamed and your team, congratulations. The question that I have is really for Nicholas, and I think maybe everybody can pitch in a little bit. You said at one point in time that that we need to stop looking at energy as a commodity, and you stopped short of saying it's actually a service. But conceptually and financially, we're still treating it as commodities. So how do you think, especially in developing countries, it's going to be a very important intellectual shift as well. So what do you think we could do better and more to actually make that shift, not only intellectually, but also in systemic way?
Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, Fadhel. Questions are coming to you. Just a quick one. For us to deliver that vision, if you could also speak to just the structures that are needed for that Pan-African industrial policy to be delivered, both at the continental level, but also how we reorganize our governments. Because if you look at the African governments, how they are organized, you have the Ministry of Trade that doesn't speak to Treasury. It's busy giving tax holidays, for example, to attract FDIs. It's not communicating with the Treasury. You have Foreign Affairs doing their own thing. So how do we organize ourselves, and what are those structures that are needed to deliver on that vision?
Thanks, Job. I have a fear that as soon as I hand back to the panelists, they're going to get too passionate again. So I'm going to ask for 3 more questions. I'm hoping folks are noting down what's coming to them before I turn back to our panelists. Please go for it, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Samba Fall. I'm working at Enda Energy, and have just it's not a question per se. It's more a contribution, and I would like just to just state recall what they have said in terms of technology transfer and financing. What is essential in Africa is how to develop national innovation system, and it's not yet there. And so how we can help each other to develop this national innovation. And the second one is...
So one please.
Yeah,
we have lots of people.
the other one is just transparency. Okay. Because we have seen JETP in Senegal, in all after the country. And what is essential, we don't know exactly how it was started. And we at ENDA, we have some thought on that, but it was not well integrated into during the discussion, during the negotiation. So after we just see, oh, okay, we have this, but we have been able to develop trajectories with African and national expertise, but sometimes it's a bit difficult to consider this insight during the negotiation. And I think that is where we have to really act on. That is my contribution.
Appreciate
and
it.
I can also share the paper on 4 for all of you.
Please.
Thank you.
Thank you. 2 more before we go. I'll take one there, and then I'm going to come back to this side.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. It was great. I'm Charlene Barnet, an energy system modeler from the Center for Applied Mathematics of Mines Paris French Engineering School. And I wanted to have your thoughts about the hydrogen hype. Is there true possible contribution of hydrogen to a just transition for Africa, or is it just serving northern countries' interest once again? Thank you.
Great question, thank you. And one more before we go. I'll take you, sir, and then we'll do one more round.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for a great panel. Chico from Amnesty International. And my question goes more to the Africa group of negotiators, and I think that will be Fatuma. And it's really quickly, how are we approaching the COP in a more synchronized manner than a fragmented manner? So, for example, in Nairobi, when we came up with the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change, the Africa group of negotiators was nowhere to be seen. From the civil society, it was mostly corporate actors formulating that. Now, at the COP as well, we were expecting an implementation framework for the declaration, because the last line of the declaration says that the African Union Commission should come up with that. The implementation framework has never been there. And then again, I was just thinking, is the Africa group of negotiators negotiating for us, having something like in that regard? And just finally...
Is it the same question?
Yeah, it's still just the same line. Just finally, sorry. So we've seen also the African Union Development Agency promoting like false climate change solutions like carbon market. And now hearing the statement of the chair of the AGN, it's like, it was not really clear whether we are for them or like not for them. So I'm just like wondering, are we somehow counting to work towards a unified, synchronized approach as a continent when we engage these spaces? Thank you.
Thank you. Fatuma, let's come to you first with that question about the AGN and unity, if you'd like to jump in there.
Yeah, okay. In terms of unity within AGN, I think that's clear. Within AGN, the positions are usually developed through a rigorous process, and we have a common African group position on all the thematic issues. So we are united in that sense. But then what happens outside there, politically, it's a different thing. Our politicians, our leaders, for example, you referred to the Nairobi one, at the Africa Climate Summit, what was going on there, and things outside this process, we are not in charge and we are not in control of that. So that is not being implemented in this process. And there are some African countries who have actually disassociated themselves from the outcome of Nairobi because it really crosses some of the red lines of African group of negotiators in this process. So I would say in this process, we are quite united on most issues. I wouldn't say on all, but yeah, we are united in that sense. Coming to carbon markets, I think carbon markets is a whole article of the Paris Agreement, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and what we are doing here, because it's one thing in terms of supporting its implementation or not, but it's another to be involved in the process in designing and elaborating on the rules around carbon markets, which Africa has to be, like as part of the UNFCCC process, we have to be part of that, and we have to negotiate things that and drive the key interest of the African continent when it comes to implementing those. But when it comes to going out there at the country level, it's up to each country to decide if they are for it or against it, because at the moment we're not deciding that in this process. That was an issue at the adoption of the Paris Agreement. It's been included, so it's part and parcel of the Paris Agreement. What we are doing from our side is just being part of that process in elaborating the implementation of the rules around carbon market.
Thanks, Fatuma. I'm going to quickly respond to the question on hydrogen. It's something that we write a bit about in the report. There's a lot of hype around green hydrogen, green inserted to make it sound great. And there's certainly, potentials in late stage for hydrogen to be used to help with industrialization. But the way that hydrogen is being operationalized and invested in is explicitly about following an extractivist playbook in Africa. The biggest problem with solar and wind, if you're a northern country or a western country, the biggest problem with African solar and wind is that you can't export it. You can't take it, right? If you turn it into hydrogen, you can. Problem is, to do that, you have to destroy half the energy and you have to use a ton of fresh water. No one wants to do that in their own countries. So there are big investments to do that in Africa so that we can use African water and African renewables to serve foreign hydrogen demands. Now, that might sound like, great investments when you hear 8 billion coming into Namibia, but it's being justified on the back of the 600 million Africans who don't have access to energy. But the things that are being built are not to deliver energy for those 600 million Africans who don't have it. So we need to be skeptical when we see plans for new energy investments in South Africa, in Namibia, in Senegal. Who are these investments for? Who are they serving? That's really the question that we have to ask, and I think same with hydrogen, we need to be skeptical there. Fadhel, there were a few questions for you. I want to turn, I hope that you can collect.
I'll try to be very brief. On investing in Africa as a risky thing, I'll go back to Germany. Germany, after 2 world wars, was a very risky, I would say dangerously risky investment, and it was done the right way, so we can do the same. And in terms of corruption and the perception of risk on the continent, the sources of that perception of risk comes precisely from the fact that we haven't invested in transformational development. So I think we can't use that as a justification for not taking initiative. And it's also, what kind of investment are we thinking of? If you're thinking it from a private sector investment, the perception of risk is one thing versus the kind of investment we're talking about. The Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Germany was an industrial strategic investment with lots of technical policy tools that we can use today, such as, for example, if your export revenues decline below a certain level and you're actually entering a crisis mode, the interest rates will decline and the economic conditions on those investments will adjust to make sure that the investment is actually successful. So I think we can do this. It's often used as an excuse for not doing the right thing. The question from Joab about what can we do on the African continent. So I think one of the problems when we talk about industrialization on the continent is that we think at the national level, and that will never work for a very simple economic fact. Industrialization requires what we call economies of scale, meaning when you manufacture a large volume of units, the cost per unit will start to decline, and efficiency starts to kick in, and quality improves. So you need large-scale production. None of our economies alone can reach those economies of scale. So it's very important to think of industrial policy as a Pan-African vision, as a Pan-African joint venture. And the best example, again, I'll go to Europe for a best joint venture industrial strategy. When Boeing used to dominate the world, Airbus didn't exist yet. Airbus could not have been created by Germany alone, or France alone, or the UK alone, because they're too small. They just can't hit the economies of scale, the market size. So it was created as a joint venture where you can use the complementarity of your resources and capabilities and the market at scale with a long-term strategic vision that goes beyond any prime minister's term, any president's term, long-term, planning. That's the kind of strategic vision that we describe in this report, not to manufacture to compete with Boeing and Airbus, but to manufacture and deploy the basic pillars of development and prosperity on the continent, starting with clean energy, clean cooking, clean transportation, and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks, Fadhel. I'm going to turn for 2 more questions before we go. We've got 5 minutes left.
There's one question that wasn't answered.
Sorry, please. Nicholas, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Just to respond to your question there on the sort of mindset shift of going from energy as a commodity to a service, and I would say a right and a basic need and something that is not just a market kind of thing, right? I think there's a lot that we can do. There's a lot that has been done, and I think that comes across here in this report. There's a lot of, there's that many new ideas, but we're kind of, looking to good experiences from the past and things that are on the table. Sometimes they're too good, and that's why they've been suppressed. In terms of the energy, I think, there's much that can be done in terms of, really strong policies that favor common approaches such as, guarantees, feed-in tariffs, the kinds of policy schemes we've seen enable a lot of unusual producers of energy to be there, households, cooperatives, farmers, small, medium-sized, industries that do other things, but on top of that they have roofs and they can put some energy on there. And if you scale that up to every roof, every industry, you have a tremendous kind of sum of capacity, right? These tools that have made this possible are very straightforward, but they're regulatory tools. They game this for the interest of the small and the distributed, and it's also a lot of those being not there just to game and be profit maximization. They need to be profitable, but it's a different kind of mindset. There's lots to kind of do, I think, that has already been done. There's scope for innovation also in terms of policies. But I think the key thing that you're talking about here is the mindset shift, right? It's about talking about it and thinking about it in a different way. Energy is not a commodity, it's a right. Sufficiency, too much energy kills us. That's wrong. How do we actually limit that? Sufficiency, well-being. That's what's in this report. And I think the really encouraging thing that we've seen since May when we released this report is that there's a craving for this. There's a huge craving for a narrative that speaks to a different model of development. There's a huge craving to see a comprehensive analysis that put these pieces together. Energy is part of a larger agenda, that is part of a larger agenda, and it goes to the root of what is the development vision. And if we think of that as something that is genuinely coming from, in this case, African societies, history, culture, ecology, not something you import through the sort of modeling of catching up and doing what the IMF and the World Bank tells you, but rather genuinely anchoring it in a different way. And again, I just want to repeat, there is no developed country on this planet. There's overdeveloped, maldeveloped, call it whatever you want. We all need to reinvent and invent the route to another development, which is, I think, the mind shift that then opens up for so many smart, clear, straightforward, commonsensical approaches and policies.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. I'm going to have to give my sincerest apologies to everyone who didn't get to ask a question. The benefit of that is it means you'll stay engaged with us in the ongoing conversation, because this is one event at a crazy COP. This needs to be a multi-year conversation. I want to say a massive thank you to the panelists, the authors, the folks who have joined us, and an even bigger thank you to all of you who have come to join us today in a very busy time. We've got a bunch of these reports up front. We haven't put them on the chairs so we don't lose our sustainability rating for the event, but they're up front. Please come and collect one from us if you'd like. And if you want to stay engaged in this conversation, the Just Transition Africa site online, you'll find it there. You can join our mailing list, stay involved in the future reports and webinars. Thank you so much once more.